Welcome to the Fright Lab. I'm Lucas Yoakum, and with me as always, well, I wasn't able to think of a clever line here. It's Joseph Wren. Joe, you can likely tell that this movie makes me feel pretty icky.
This might be the first film that really makes you feel icky. Unless you're me, that's going to be Oldboy. How are you tonight, all of you gruesome people? I can't believe we're here. Somehow, we've talked Lucas into not just writing an episode about Audition, but voluntarily watching it again, which is unfortunately what I had to do this week. And I'll be honest, while this is one of the first real horror movies from the other side of the pond I was able to consume years ago, it lived up to its own hype in a very different way that we're going to talk about tonight. So I hope you're strapped in, all of you gruesome people. I hope you have assembled your meat-cutting attire and have applied an apron in the most effective way possible, because it's going to get gruesome tonight. But it's not going to be a gruesome fest. Would you agree, Lucas?
You know, I'm going to touch on all of this as we go, but I just want to say this aloud. I love the movie Audition in the way that Werner Herzog once said that he loves the jungle. That he loves the jungle. Shouldn't be confused with hating it, that he loves the jungle, just against his better judgment. So, I do remember the first time I saw Miike Takashi's Audition. After it ended, I knew that there was like this whole new world of horror out there. You know, compared to a movie like Pasolini's Salo, Audition is still a fairly normal film. But that's an unfair comparison, right? Most movies are easier to handle than Salo. In many ways, I think Audition, or some of Miike's other works, pick up where Hellraiser leaves off. In a previous episode, I said that Hellraiser can sort of be a good intro into more extreme flavors of horror. If you find that the Hellraiser films are great but a little too fantastical, a film like Audition might be the type of disturbing you'll appreciate. And yet, I'm not the sort of horror fan who simply wants to be upset at a movie. Most of our fans might love a good blood fountain. That still leaves room for more heady, and therefore more distressing types of terror, in my understanding anyway. So what is it about Audition, then? Why am I talking about this movie this way? You'd think I'm actually handling the Hellraiser Lament configuration, right? It's just a movie. Well, maybe. Audition is a movie with a lot to say, and in many ways, Audition feels a little like it predicted a certain future. Not in the science fiction sense, but more in a social science sense. Audition is speaking to a certain type of very human emotion, very human experiences. But Miike and his film aren't speaking to us so simply, right? They're also trying to make you feel, you know, pretty freaking gross about it at the same time.
Wow, that's an understatement.
Yeah. I personally feel that Audition is very much a sum of its parts sort of movie. The source material, combined with the visions of the director, that's a strong armature. It's a good skeleton to sit everything upon. The cast and crew, the use of cinematography and sound design, all of those combine to create a gruesome, hard-hitting film. So that means we got to do what we do best on this show. First, we have to talk about the career of Miike Takashi. Next, we need to talk about the plot of Audition and what's going on screen. And that will lead us, at last, to questions about the background of the film, both socially and along its apparent themes. One last thing, though, before we get started. Content warning. For just about everything in this film, Audition deals with the dark sides of human relationships, and that includes a lot of implied sexual ugliness and otherwise on-screen violence. We won't go into real graphic depictions of that sort of thing on the show. We just try to avoid that, really. But we would be remiss to not mention that it exists in this film. And if you don't want to deal with that sort of subject matter, we get it. let this one pass you by, okay? Now, let's dive in. You'll want to bring a couple of tarps with you. Most of us who are into Miike films probably started with Ichi the Killer, Audition, or Visitor Q. Arguably, these are his best known films, at least for non-Japanese audiences. But Miike really cut his teeth in the Japanese direct-to-video market, or what they call V-cinema. Visitor Q is a V-cinema piece, and it came out in the same year as Audition. Think about that for just a few minutes. Miike made a ton of V-cinema pieces, and sadly, I don't think most of them have made it over across international waters. I would love to see that because I'd love to see what he was doing at that time otherwise. But anyway, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the whole quote-unquote extreme Asian cinema thing got started. And I want to do an episode about that eventually because that's actually a pretty deep subject. Think about the three aforementioned Miike films, right? As well as stuff like Battle Royale, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, and Old Boy, along with Junji Ito's Tomie series of manga and films, as well as, you know, everything else that Junji Ito did, which is hard enough to watch. Joe, are you familiar with Junji Ito?
No, sir, but I am a fan of the Vengeance trilogy.
Yeah.
I do believe now you could call it a quadrilogy, though I don't want to talk about that today. That's a lot of brutality for the sake of revenge. And I'm glad you brought those films up because I want to make a case for Audition as being a revenge film where the person who was wronged just went too far the wrong direction.
Sure, and we'll kind of get into that as the episode goes along because I have some very strong feelings about that as well. Junji Ito is kind of on the other side of the spectrum from Miike. His movies and manga are entirely more spiritual, maybe. They're maybe a little more metaphysical, a little more haunted housey than others. He's maybe, at least for me and the social group that I came up in, he was best known for a series of manga called Uzumaki, which is just one of the most upsetting things I've ever seen. It is just truly, truly distressing. There was a film adaptation of Uzumaki that's it's kind of a mixed bag. It would be hard to capture the horror of that graphic novel series, but you know, we're not here to talk about Junji Ito. So, for me, Miike's films are maybe the most emblematic of that whole extreme Asian cinema thing. Part of that has to do with horror movies not really being the extent of his career. Take movies like The Great Yokai War. This was his attempt at reiterating the yokai films of the 1960s, and those are films about the monsters of traditional Japanese folklore. It's a neat subject. That comes out in 2005. But consider back in 2001, the year he released Ichi the Killer, he also released The Happiness of the Katakuris. I genuinely don't know where to start talking about The Happiness of the Katakuris. This movie is absolutely insane, but not as nearly like crushingly darkly insane as his other works, or Audition for that matter. So yeah, wild movie. It's just tonally way more light or more overtly fun than Ichi the Killer, though again, most things are more overtly fun than Ichi the Killer. Miike would go on to make two movies that I absolutely adore. He made modern kind of remakes, reiterations, whatever you want to call them, of a pair of classic samurai dramas, 13 Assassins and Harakiri, Death of a Samurai. If you don't watch anything else of his canon, go find those two. They're really, really good. And they aren't nearly as brutal as his other stuff, though, like, let's be honest, they're not exactly a cakewalk. You know, walk in knowing that it's going to be a little rough.
I feel like I'm learning something today. Understatement of the day, by the way, is Ichi the Killer so weird because it's V Cinema?
Well, Visitor Q is V Cinema. And I will tell you, have you seen Visitor Q?
No.
Visitor Q is a fucking nightmare. It's very interesting, but it is the very definition of a hard watch. It is just brutal and rough and gruesome. It's kind of found footagey. It's kind of a family drama in the most gut-churning sense of the word. I think it might be as fucking weird as it is because it's V Cinema, because you could kind of get away more with direct-to-cinema or direct-to-video markets. But is Ichi the Killer weird because, man, I think Ichi the Killer is weird because the source material is weird. Takashi Miike is weird. I think the whole thing is just weird. I would love to have a good answer for that, really.
Been a while with that one. I might have to revisit it.
Have fun, I guess.
Or we could watch Ricky Ho.
Well,
the story of Ricky.
That would feel a little like cleaner anyway. So, you know, make of that what you will.
Did you just call Ricky Ho cleaner?
Wow. Than Visitor Q? Oh, by a long shot. By a long shot. It's way less upsetting. So, it's good to know, by the way, that Miike is still at it. He released a movie just last year, 2023. He even earned a spot in the early 2000s in the Masters of Horror series for Showtime with a short film called Imprint. Fun fact, Imprint is the only movie in the Masters of Horror series that was not allowed to be shown on TV. That is to say, on the cable network Showtime. Rumor has it that the show's producer described it as the most disturbing movie he'd ever seen. And that producer? Mick fucking Garris. You gotta be pretty intense to give that guy the chills. Having seen Imprint and owning a copy of it personally, I can tell you it's pretty fucking rough. Definitely a good, bad intro to Miike's work. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where to go with that. All that is to say, the man knows what he is doing when it comes to getting gross and ugly. So, getting back to Audition. The movie was based on a 1997 novel by Murakami Ryu, but I have to level with our audience here when I say that I've never read it, so I'm just talking about the movie. If you want to tell me your opinions of the book, email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. So, now, gotta stop stalling. Let's get started with talking about the movie. Aoyama Shigeharu is a widower and a single father. He's a business owner, and he's doing the best he can to raise his son. After several years, he realizes something that has eluded him. He's been alone for a long time, and he would like to meet someone new. But Aoyama has some, well, old-fashioned ideas about what he wants from a potential wife or partner. Over drinks one night, he explains this to his friend. A friend who works in the film industry. And this friend, Yasuhisa, comes up with a unique solution to Aoyama's issues. He offers to hold an audition for actresses for a movie, which would allow Aoyama the opportunity to interview his would-be paramours. And that's how Aoyama meets Asami, who is masterfully portrayed by Shiina Ihi. And yes, if your ears perked up at her name, you're probably thinking about her career as either a model for the firm Benetton or her in the starring role of Tokyo Gore Police.
Hell yes!
I think whichever one you pick there, if you recognized her as a Benetton model or for Tokyo Gore Police, there's like a two wolves inside you kind of a conversation there to be had. Asami is polite, cultured, well-spoken. She's extremely feminine in a classical sense. She grew up dancing ballet and would love the chance to break into movies. Aoyama is smitten, and she clearly likes him. Sounds like a fun little meet cute, right? If so, you have never seen a Miike film. Asami has secrets. Dark secrets. Think pitch black secrets. You might say she's a little bit possessive. And worse, she has plans. Needless to say, it gets ugly. The first half of Audition, if it stopped going on longer than it does, would be just like a quirky rom-com about two different people trying to make it in a world with crazy things going on. But the shift in the plot starts to happen slowly. It plays with dreamlike narrative beats and then switches, almost suddenly, into something so much worse. The last half of the film is something so incredibly ugly, it's hard to believe that Miike was ever going to become a mainstream filmmaker. Again, it's no Solo or like August Underground Mortem. The last scenes of the film are gut-churning, but not the worst thing ever filmed, not by a long shot. But there is something very off about the first half of the movie. It's filmed in such a way that just feels wrong somehow. The conversation between Aoyama and Yasuhisa at a bar, which, precedes the whole plot, is shot at this kind of strange angle. Later on in the film, the two of them are having a conversation on a rooftop about Aoyama's interest in this woman. It's filmed from behind a golf screen, like a putting screen for practice, and it's done diegetically. The golf screen is part of the scene, actually. So it's weird and out of focus, and it kind of violates some of the basic rules of like photography or cinematography. Everything about this movie is just a little cattywampus at best. So that's the surface level of the film. Yeah, it's fucked up. So what's happening under the hood? That's where I like to go. Audition is a film about relationships, loneliness, and these sometimes messy things people do to try and connect with someone else. On the surface level, Audition isn't really any different than like a half dozen Ryan Reynolds joints, right? Minus the hideous violence and themes of sexual abuse, of course. This makes me want to ask a question of that as well. It's admittedly a little bit of an unfair question. Before we do so, real quick, mild spoilers ahead. Joe will add timestamps to the post in post.
The next section of the Fright Lab contains spoilers for the film Audition. If you'd like to be surprised when you watch this movie, skip forward to 21 minutes and 21 seconds.
Asami goes after Aoyama with violence not seen outside of Hannibal Lecter's private journals, Aoyama misled Asami with this whole audition ruse. And let's be honest, Aoyama is not the nicest guy. It's implied that he slept with one of his employees, and it seems like he may have misled her around that. That's not fucking cool. That's abusing one's position of power over someone else and taking advantage of someone, But does he deserve to be maimed? Of course not. That's obvious. But if you've ever had someone screw around with your emotions, you know how much that hurts. And Asami has been through some shit. She's suffered abuse and neglect. She needs professional help. She needs someone to just show her kindness and to acknowledge her dignity. We've all heard the saying, hurt people hurt people. And maybe that's not so true that it's become axiomatic, but we've all seen it in real life, right? Normally, I find antagonists in horror films to be fun, but ultimately awful. Outside of a group like the Cenobites, most of the villains in horror are just real pricks, And when you're talking about a group like the Cenobites, they're part of a spiritual machinery that preys upon the darkest parts of the human heart. Asami is something of a special case, though. She's done some genuinely brutal things that make her a little hard to forgive as a person. But then again, hurt people hurt people. She's lashing out and refuses to be taken advantage of. Well, maybe. Some of her off-screen kills are questionable, but at least one of them makes absolute sense, if only in a Miike Takashi kind of way. And as for Aoyama, his behavior isn't acceptable, but like Asami, he's clearly a hurt person living with a lot of responsibilities. He's also clearly not over the death of his wife. Understandable, I think. Loneliness is a very real emotion that runs through the core of this movie. Revolting as it might sound, there's an elegance to that film in this regard. Asami and Aoyama are clearly lonely. and they're trying to tackle life in the boom of like modern day, hyper modern Japan. I'm gonna wager that a part of our audience has at some point been on a dating site. No shame and no judgment. I've done it before in previous years. Gruesome, isn't it? Dating sites suck. It's a slog having to send out so many messages with zero guarantee that you'll hear back. Worse still is the treatment that I'm sure many women in our audience can attend to and understand. You know, think about the disgusting comments or crude pickup lines that you've had to read, much less the potential threats that seem to just plague women online. Our modern world chews up and spits out people in their moments of need. And it seems to me that Miike is acutely aware of this. I might even argue that the original author, Murakami, and Miike both sort of predicted the oncoming romantic malaise that the 21st century was going to bring about. And I shudder to think how this movie would have played out with an OkCupid profile involved. Back to my point. Miike does a neat trick with a lot of his movies. He finds something very human, something very believable about the characters he's portraying. He really seems to push the cast to show that. Shiina Ihe, who portrays Asami, is genuinely good at projecting menace. Her threat is like that of a giant insect. And I imagine that having to deal with her in real life, were she a real person, dealing with her violence would be like tangling with a giant mantis. It's just alien and cold. But in quieter moments of the film, there is something extremely soft about the character of Asami. Her voice always feels just above a whisper, and her physical presence is manicured. It's a presentation, but it never feels false. If it weren't for that whole like torture and murder thing, she would be an absolutely calming presence in your life. Both the director and the actress bring this to the screen masterfully. And this brings up another conundrum for me, as both a critic and as a fan of this movie. Should you feel some sympathy for an antagonist like Asami? It's easy to say some characters, like Michael Myers, for instance, they're a little hard to forgive, maybe. But Asami's life is so horrific, it's hard to stomach. Again, hard to overlook torture, but easy to understand someone who's been through a boatload of trauma. If you go back to episode 12 of our show, we discuss films that are conceptually called elevated horror. A recurring theme throughout movies with the tag elevated horror is a discussion of trauma, either overt or symbolic. While Audition has a certain elegance, maybe even an artfulness, it completely avoids any sort of elevation. It's a gross movie that doesn't seem to give a shit about being tasteful or artful. That's a delicate balance, to have those sort of deeply human elements while also being kind of a splatter flick. You know what I mean? Joe, can you think of any other examples that we could call like an artful splatter flick?
No. Because how often is a splatter flick just about the splatter, right? The closest thing that comes to mind is Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, or Lady Vengeance as it was released in America. Because that's a movie about calculated revenge where the kills are reasonably justified when you realize how that person is thinking and how they are handling that situation. But it's not elevated horror. It's truly about revenge. I can't think of an elevated horror movie that goes to that level of art. But I do want to talk about this movie in a little bit greater detail, so here's your second spoiler warning for a new concept. We've been using it a lot today. This section of the Fright Lab contains mild spoilers, a thought experiment, and a joke. Listener discretion always advised. If you'd like to be surprised, once again, skip forward to 40 minutes and 40 seconds. Audition is this dreamlike film. It's easy to point to David Lynch or a movie like House and say, this movie is trying to be dreamlike. You talked about the camera angles and you talked about how everything is just a little bit off. And I used to think that this film, in its entirety, is what is happening in the character's mind after he's been drugged. There's a point in this movie where something's in the drink, he falls over in a perfect pratfall, and then you have another 30 minutes of information because now he's starting to remember and put things together and have that end of your life experience. But a lot of the scenes, and you talked about the justified kill, I don't even want to spoil that today because there is a kill that you want to happen that eventually does happen. But isn't the backstory of Asami that she was physically abused?
Yeah, it's implied. It's never directly shown, but she was clearly physically abused, and it's implied that she was sexually abused as well.
I wanted to ask that question also because when she does the full Black Widow thing and goes through with the deed, she talks about, I'm going to show you me. I'm going to show you my scars and see if you still accept me. And that's kind of a bullshit move for her because she's always planning to kill this guy. Like you said, she has plans. I strongly believe she is so far gone that she has selected a target and she has every sequence of event planned out ahead of time. Everything that she's going to do, everything that she's going to say, when she's going to spend the night with him, that's all calculated. That's all to make him care. That's all to get him to make the phone call. But when she starts showing him the horror, is that stuff that he just made up laying on the floor at the end of the movie? Or is that all stuff that clearly happened? Because you don't ever see what's in the bag until he's seemingly in the apartment and the bag is revealed.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's some elements of the film that you talked about, the dreamlike kind of qualities that pop up throughout this movie that really do bear discussing, right? Yet another spoiler warning at this point. If you're this far along, I don't know what to tell you. So there's a sequence in the film in the apartment, in Asami's apartment, which is, shall we say, in need of a sweep, where it's showing Aoyama being almost sexually assaulted, I think, by Asami, but in his head, it's also multiple other people that are doing this to him, and he's not okay with it. I mean, he's very much a victim in this scene, hands down, no question asked. But there's also kind of an element there of, yeah, that might be the dreams of someone who just got drugged and is about to get absolutely fucking mauled by, again, someone with the attitude of an insect. But there's another part of me that kind of looks at it and goes, I don't think Miike was maybe making the distinction. I don't think he was showing us dreamlike or reality. I think he was just showing that to kick us in the balls a little bit. There's a complicity to this movie. You know, if you are going along with it, you're stuck. This is on you for taking part in this film. When I think about the personality of a director, like the personality of their art style, the two words that come to mind is little stinker. He's kind of like, you're watching this. You know, he's kind of holding it over you a little bit. I appreciate that. I have a little bit of that in my heart, I think. But there's a part of me that looks at that thing and says, like, yeah, maybe in a way she did plan it. Like, she sort of knew. I don't know if she, like, in the sense of a real serial killer, like a real life serial killer, like Ted Bundy or like John Wayne Gacy, I don't think she gets off on the murder. I don't know that it's a sex thing. I think it's some other thing. It's a vengeance thing taken to its most, I don't know if it's maybe its natural conclusion, but it is to its furthest extreme.
And I'm relying on the subtitles, but what is the thing she says at the end of the film before she starts butchering him? If you're going to have all of me, then I have to cut you into little pieces. I'm, of course,
it's something to that
exaggerating.
Effect, yeah.
Like it doesn't make sense at that point in the movie where it is a truly disturbing scene, and why I say that she's gone. You talk about Miike showing every character in this movie, and even when he's showing backstory, he's showing you and reminding you that this is not a good person. I think the challenge ultimately is, no matter how fucked up a person is, do they deserve this? And I think the answer is no. But when she's just waiting for the phone to ring, is this so targeted that she's focusing on one person? Because I think the content of that scene and the later scene in the apartment will tell you, no, she has many lines out there. And like an insect, like a spider in a web, it doesn't matter who calls, the phone rang. That's what she's excited about.
You think she might have had multiple victims on the hook, so to speak?
Absolutely. She has more than one in the present timeline of this movie.
That's true. You have the unfortunate, her unfortunate roommate, let's say.
I think that's the exact way to say it. And that might be, I've never thought about this before, but here we go. All of the flashbacks showing what happened to her and how she ultimately took revenge on that situation. That plot is a sequel to Lady Vengeance, or another entry in that series. Everything that happens to our main character, even the part where he's being assaulted mentally and you're seeing these thoughts that are in his head, that's supposed to challenge you, the viewer, and remind you that, yeah, people have had really bad thoughts that they don't follow through on. And this must be what it feels like to have one of those in real time. I've never thought about this before, though. Have you ever considered that her unfortunate roommate might be a relationship she had, that she just enough is enough and became this brutalizing killer?
You know, the movie does not incentivize us in any way to think too terribly much about the poor son of a bitch she lives with. It absolutely does not behoove us in any way. But, you know, if you want to get...
she's been practicing.
If you want to get non-diegetic, if you want to get outside of the realm of the explicit plot, if you want to engage in a little extra textual exegesis, you could easily start asking questions about who that victim is. The one victim that deserves the murder, and you and I both know which one we're talking about, yeah, fuck that guy. He had that coming one way or another in a cinematic sense. I understand that. But the other victim, was it just a relationship that went sour? Was this someone who had abused her? It's implied that she knew this person from a professional environment, but it's never said like, oh yeah, and he beat the shit out of her, or he dressed her down in front of a bunch of people, or whatever. It's just that, oh yeah, by the way, she did this terrible series of things to this poor guy, but by the point you see him, he's mentally pretty far gone. Like, there's probably no helping this guy, really. If he doesn't die of his injuries, he'll die of something else fairly soon, I'd imagine, or at least I'd hope, poor bastard. When I look at a character like that, though, it's never talked about. And I think there's an interesting question to ask. You know, clearly, yes, she's been practicing. She's done this before, probably more times than that even. But there's another part of me that kind of looks at that and goes, whatever that guy did he deserve that? And there's a part of me that I think is just kind of an empathetic human being. I have sympathy for my fellow man. So, well, most of the time anyway, unless it's a horror movie, apparently. There's a part of me that looks at that character and says, oh, you know, God, what could he have done that was truly that bad? That's the rest of his life for however long it goes on. So I don't know. That's a really interesting question. And I tend to not kind of think too far outside of the script, but getting into the question of, did she have more victims on the hook? I think for me, it's much more chilling if she doesn't.
Agreed.
If she's just waiting for the right one. She's waiting for the one that for whatever reason is really gonna fucking do it for her. Like there's gotta be someone in this world that she's waiting for. And you know, again, for those of us who have ever used a dating site, we know what it's like to comb through dozens of people to go on dates and go, oh, well, this didn't work out, or this person isn't great, or oh, this person doesn't look like what they said they did, or whatever. And just move on. Most of us don't proceed to torture and murder everyone we're on a bad date with.
Nor should we.
And nor should we. I know we're the Fright Lab is taking the bold stance of don't murder bad dates.
Just don't murder. Let's stop there, shall we?
Maybe we shouldn't murder people. Maybe that's a good moral standard to hold up.
Without spoiling the ending, our main character does not die. There are, count, only 3 kills in this movie that is famous for being so brutal, during the ending sequence, where the true brutality of the film happens, it's not a dream. If anything, it's intentionally not dreamlike. The other kills could be. This one is very intentionally not. And it goes on for what feels like 15 minutes in my mind. It's probably not that long. But here's a thought experiment for you. What saves his life is his son coming home and interrupting. Imagine, if you will, everything that leads up to that from the son's perspective. What happened? He walked home. He probably stopped to get something to eat. He rode a bus. Things like that happened. I would enjoy a version of this film, a sequel to this film, that is entirely from the son's perspective. What is he? He's a teenager. He's in high school.
It's implied that he's maybe like 9th grade. Like, there's some stuff in the plot that makes him feel a little younger, but visually he looks like he's maybe early high school would be my guess.
It would be interesting to me to see a film, probably a melodrama from what that character is in this film, but how does he see his father? And to walk in at the end of this, to have that shocking moment and just letting it play out the same way, I would be interested in that story, because we, the audience, know for that last 10 minutes while he's walking off the bus to get to his house, you know what's been going on, and he has no idea. And he still, he threw her off enough to get the upper hand. Her.
You know, we've all seen that comedic trope where someone walks into a situation and they see some insanity happening and someone looks over and goes, listen, I know how this looks.
Thank you, Mateo.
Exactly. This is one of those absolutely insane situations. It reminds me of a joke someone told me. There's a traveling salesman. He's going house to house and he's trying to sell dictionaries or something. And he arrives at the house and he knocks on the door, and a kid about 13 answers the door, and he's wearing like a Halloween mask. His dad's like fishing waders. He's got a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and a copy of Playboy in his hand. And the traveling salesman's kind of taken back, but he recovers quickly and goes, excuse me, man, are your parents home? And the kid takes a cigarette out of his mouth and goes, "Does it fucking look like my parents are home?" It's that kind of situation. It is you know, you just got off school, so you stop by the tonkatsu place and you get dinner and you take the bus home, and you're probably listening to your Discman as you're getting there, and you get home and your father is being fucking butchered on the floor. Well, look, I know this looks bad. Well, what do you do? Well, and it's interesting that you make the point that he gets the advantage on Asami. He actually finishes her off, so to speak. And I think it's so interesting because she's not played as the typical horror movie villain that you shoot him, you stab him, you push him down a flight of stairs and they get up and keep moving. No, once she's down, she's down. That's pretty much it, because that's how that really tends to go. And so I think that's such an interesting way to conclude the story, is that the one person who's been kind of a non-entity throughout the movie is suddenly the one who I guess saves the day. Calling that a happy ending is a bit of a fucking stretch, I think.
And it justifies what you said earlier. She's so focused on one person. She doesn't have a plan if somebody shows up.
Yeah.
She's thrown off. She's surprised.
But
she literally has a spray bottle, which I always took that as she's made some kind of homemade mace. Then I thought about it. Nope. She probably just has a bottle of water like a cat, like down, down, down. It's much funnier to me to think of it that way, because that's all it is.
I think early mace cans were not quite as powerful as they are now, but no, it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting thought. Is what if that's just like, I don't know, a hand sanitizer spray or something, and she's just having to fucking improvise? Or did she grab a can of mace in case this guy wasn't drugged enough and she needs to put him on the floor? Who knows? Again, I've never read the book, so I could be talking out of my ass there. Or it could be she just had to improvise and
Oh my God, did she just pick up like a bottle of cleaner that was sitting on the floor?
Hey man, have you ever gotten Windex in your eyes? It sucks.
Absolutely, it does.
So maybe that's the case. I don't know. When you look at all of her weapons, right? Like the weapons she brings to deal with Aoyama, at no point are those the weapons you fight somebody off with. If you want to fight somebody off, you have a knife, you have a baseball bat, you have a can of mace, something like that. All of the weapons she uses for her kills are assassin's weapons. They're weapons you use to take care of someone who's not either seeing it coming or is completely defenseless.
What if he's got a pointed stick? I'm sorry, dude.
I know.
I'm not even going to keep it in the episode, but
No.
might...
Leave it in. Leave it in. That's fine. A less skillful and maybe less insightful director than Miike would have made a mere exploitation flick out of Audition. To his credit, I think he really took a higher path and made a horror film that is genuinely a piece of cinema, if you know what I mean. A revolting, fluid-soaked headfuck of a piece of cinema, but no less a piece of cinema. I also think there's a real difference between someone like Miike and someone like Ari Aster, the guy who directed Midsommar and Hereditary. Well-made horror is a rarity. So much so that movies like this really do stand out. I had a fun encounter when I was coming up with and writing this episode. An acquaintance of mine who's aware of the show was asking me what I was going to be talking about with some upcoming episodes. And when I told him that I was going to be working on Audition, he visibly shuddered. This movie is so well known that it can reach out and really hit people who are not deep in the fandom, you know? That's an impressive feat. Not everyone has seen Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, but it seems like a lot of people know that you can do some awful thing with acupuncture needles. So for me, that's what makes Audition the perfect sort of movie for this show, right? I like it when there's a lot to chew on and plenty that you end up wanting to spit out. Horror might not always be as elegant as Audition, and maybe that's a good thing. So what about you, my dear audience? Can you find any sort of sympathy for Asami? What's your favorite Miike flick? Is there some other piece of extreme horror from Asia, quote unquote, that I should be checking out? You need to let us know. You can email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram at fright_lab_pod, as well as letterboxed, all one word, Fright Lab Pod. Joe, can you tell our audience where they can find us on Discord and where else our gruesome people might find your other work?
Discord is where this conversation will become the depths of depravity and deep terror. And I was trying to find a way to tie everything together with D's, but that's okay. Discord is where we are and where we want you to be. You heard Lucas say it. We're on Letterboxd. We're on Instagram. You can email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. Thefrightlab.com is where this podcast can be found, and discord.thefrightlab.com is where you can find that server. That is where this conversation is going on all the time. Lucas just spent 2 hours streaming a very high-level run of Vampire Survivors that should not have ended, but had to, because people got to go to bed sometimes. But that's where the conversation is happening, and that's where we want you to be. There will be links to all of that in the show notes. If you're a fan of heavy metal topics, heavy metal subjects, and heavy metal bands, you need to check out the podcasts we are creating at discussmetal.com. We talk about your favorite bands, my favorite bands. I've been hanging out with AJ and John of the Nerf Herder Council, talking about Star Trek, watching them talk about Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and everything else in between. Listener, you, fan of this podcast, thank you for listening, and I hope you've subscribed because we will be releasing more episodes. I need you to take out your phone. I need you to scroll to the left. I need you to scroll to the right. Find the place in your podcast app of choice where you can give us the 5-star review, the thumbs up, leave comments, or send us an email. You heard Lucas say it. Links are in the show notes. Lucas!
Yes, sir.
Tell everyone how much we love independent artists and independent media.
You know, I said it a few episodes ago that I believe sincerely that 2024 is going to be a great year for indie horror because, historically speaking, 2023, 2022, and many points backwards were great years for indie horror. And not just indie horror movies, but indie horror media, be that podcasts, music, you get the idea. We love DIY art because that's what we're doing right here, right now. And we want to help form a community of that sort of thing. So, again, reach out to us at our email if you have a project you think we should be checking out. As always, The Fright Lab is written and researched by me, Lucas Yoakum. Joseph Wren is our amazing producer and co-host. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we will talk to you all very soon.
That's Fright Lab for you.